Welcome to Cracking Legal Innovation, the podcast where we go behind the scenes with the people reshaping how legal work gets done. My name is Daniel Porus, Chief Commercial Officer at Legatics, and I'm joined by my co-host, Legatics CEO Anthony Seale. Today we're exploring one of the most important questions facing law firm leaders. What non-lawyer skills do law firms need to hire for and develop if they want to remain competitive? To discuss this topic, we're delighted to be joined by Ilona Logvinova, Global Chief AI Officer at HSFK Kramer. Ilona leads the firm's global digitalization and AI strategy, embedding AI across its worldwide practice. A lawyer by training, she's a recognized leader at the intersection of AI, law, and innovation, with a career spanning digital transformation at McKinsey, MasterCard, Cleary, and now HSFK Kramer. She also advises legal AI startups and is a frequent industry speaker and author. We plan to discuss the non-legal capabilities law firms need, from design thinking and data literacy to AI oversight and change leadership, and what it takes for law firms to build a new model of talent for the coming decade. Welcome, Ilona.
Thank you so much, Daniel and Anthony. It's so great to be here. I really appreciate the invite.
So, Ilona, you sit in a role that didn't really exist in law firms 5 years ago, and you've also worked inside elite law firms and in organizations like McKinsey and MasterCard. So you do have a rare vantage point on how capability is built and where law firms struggle. Before we dive into specific skills, from where you sit today, do you think that most law firms truly understand how much the nature of a lawyer's role is changing, or do you think we're still underestimating it?
I think the question of how do we train our lawyers, how do we start to think differently about skill sets and capabilities and building those capabilities has to map towards what are the jobs going to be in 5 years and 10 years, right? What is it that we are setting up for? And then we can think about how do we map to that and develop the skill sets that are needed. And to do that, you need imagination, right? You need to explore what the trajectories are from a strategic perspective. You need to understand what clients want and what the direction of travel is in terms of our industry. And that's really the fascinating piece for me, right? When we start to think about it, because that's where you get into the interesting discussion of the future of law that has to be happening now, right? So we will be delivering in this way 18 months from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now. But what does that mean right now? How do we upskill ourselves? How do we think differently about what we're delivering and how? And I think the answer necessarily has to be embedded with technology. And that doesn't mean that lawyers need to be technologists, but it does mean that there has to be a recognition of the importance of hybrid intelligence, which is something that I talk about often. It's a concept that I first heard about at McKinsey, right? And it's this idea that we can work in an integrated way with human and machine intelligence and essentially just elevate intelligence more broadly. So it doesn't need to be isolated to the realm of technology or machines or just human intelligence, relying on a piece of tech. But the power is really in the integration. And that is really powerful because once you start to think about it that way, then you start to reimagine what delivery can look like. And you start to think about, well, what are the skill sets that, associates might need, the partners might need, that business services across firms might need. And then you start to realize that there is a broader upskilling effort. And I think firms are starting to really dig into that.
I love that hyper-intelligence idea. I think even since the calculator, machines can be kind of inherently intelligent in ways that humans are not. So we're not very good at adding things up, but we're good at the context around it. And I'm interested maybe on the hyper-intelligence point. Do you think this isn't so much about augmenting people, but this is about doing something bigger and better than people could have ever done?
Yeah. And I love this question too. I actually, a few years ago, I was really interested in the idea in the emerging field of cyborg law. And what that essentially means is how humans are integrated with machines. I gave a talk at the University of Montreal a few years ago on this and how there's actual case law on this, right? And the Supreme Court has evaluated what it means to extend human protections, right? Privacy protections, constitutional protections to the technology carried by humans. And I forget which Supreme Court justice it was, but there was a case where one of the Supreme Court justices essentially was evaluating whether in a search and seizure, a phone could be searched right? And data on a phone could be searched. And he said, essentially, it was deemed that the phone was an extension of the human because it was essentially almost an appendage, right? Because we are so heavily integrated with our phones. And remember, this is not 2025 or 2026, right? This is years ago. And if we think about it that way, and how all humans are now becoming more cyborgian as we go forward, and what that means is essentially just more and more integrated with tech and how we use it, both from a hardware perspective and now, with the emergence of generative AI from a software perspective. I think certainly the conversation becomes elevated from augmentation to really a new elevated tranche of opportunity where you just get that elevated intelligence. It's not even augmented, it's just a different level playing field on which you can operate. And I think that's what we're starting to see the possibility of. And, there's the question of singularity and artificial general intelligence and what that means and when that convergence will be happening. But I think we're starting to see the early signs of that now because the LLMs are getting so sophisticated, right? The context, reasoning via context is becoming so much more sophisticated that I think the short answer has to be yes. And then if that's true, then what does that mean for the practice of law, right? And I think the answer has to be data enrichment, because we can only operate with a certain sphere of data as humans with the human mind. But once you enrich that capability, that human capability with, AI empowered capability, then you really get that step change in terms of what you can analyze and what you can advise and what you can provide for clients.
So I'd be interested in your perspective, Ilona, of something Nancy and I have talked a bit about. How much do you think that when we're thinking of the lawyer of the future, how much of it is skills that you're looking for versus mindset?
This is such an important question. And Andreessen talks about this quite a bit, Jensen Huang, other leaders that are engaged in the broader conversation around generative AI and what that means for society are talking about this publicly. And the bottom line seems to be we have to know how to learn how to learn. There has to be that agility, that has to be adaptability, applied intelligence, fluid intelligence, navigation quotient, NQ, as we used to say at McKinsey. That I think is really, really important, that ability to navigate, because the content will change. And I think the phrase change is the only constant is very much real. And so that means that we have to be able to absorb and adapt, right? And be agile in our intelligence and our applied intelligence and the application of machine intelligence to what we're doing. And then, that's where I think we'll see success. But it's not about becoming a subject matter expert and staying within that domain of expertise. I don't think that's how we set up for success in the future.
So I 100% agree, but so many of the things that you've just described feel the complete polar opposite to what I think of for most lawyers. We're trained not to be, that adaptable. It's all about precedent and doing the things the way it's always been done. So how do you think about that within a law firm context if all these things are so important for the transformation that you're looking to achieve?
I think about it. So I'm a philosophy major, right? That's sort of where I anchor how I think about things. And what that essentially means is that you're making sense of abstract concepts and ideas in abstract space, and you're making it concrete, and you're making things more logical and provable, right? You and making sense out of things that may not make sense in the first place. And I think what lawyers are trained to do is essentially based on a system of deductive reasoning, right? We are always looking at precedent and we're saying, this makes sense because of X, this makes sense because of Y, and then we're getting down to it through the argument. And I think we need to flip that for the world of the future, which is taking place now, and really be proficient and excel in inductive reasoning. So not this is true because of this, but grabbing outwards and saying, this, exists in a parallel sector, and this is true in a different industry, and this has shown success in a different industry, and this applies to us because we can draw this analog, we can draw this parallel, we can learn X, Y, Z, and that would augment our that would strengthen our positioning or strengthen the reasoning or the advisory. And once you couple that deductive reasoning with inductive reasoning, there is where I think you'll get that, that new and enhanced level of capability with lawyers. But it is a different way of thinking, and it's a different way of learning. And I think the optimistic side of me is excited about the law school, shift in curricula that I'm seeing and how they're starting to adopt Gen AI into their curriculums. right? And how law firms are starting to think about this in a much more future forward way.
Maybe slightly back to Dan's point. Do you explain it to them like that?
So in everyday practice, I think deploying a baseline capability, right? So whether it's, ChatGPT for enterprise, Harvey, Legora, right? Other tools, having generative AI available for an organization so that your lawyers understand how to work with it, and then teaching them the opportunity landscape and saying, this is how you can start to engage with this technology, right? And then introducing the opportunity to analyze in a different way. So you're not just looking at the last four precedents, right, in a transaction in a corporate matter, but you can now look at, 100 precedents, 100 deals. You can now think about it in this way. You can draw, benchmarks from a much broader set of data. The scope of the analysis changes. And so then your aperture of thinking and analysis has to shift essentially. And through that kind of tangible application of the technology, right, and the new capabilities internally, that's where I'd like to focus energies, right? But this is all evolving. I don't think, it's not a hard and fast set of, playbooks just yet. But I think this is an evolving conversation where you are essentially reimagining how you're working and what your workflows look like every day.
I do think that was like a bit of a problem in the start of AI is people were going like, okay, we've had a human do it like this and we've had an AI do it like this. And you're always comparing the task as the same task. And you're like, well, the human accuracy was 98% and the AI accuracy was 97% or 99% or something like that. But you're just always thinking about what AI can do as a subset of what a human can do. The only win you can get is kind of efficiency or potentially slightly greater accuracy or having a second source of check. But like, I do love this idea of being able to achieve more, like review far more sources or find some tiny piece of case law somewhere that, a human never would have had the capacity to find. That does change the question, I think.
This idea just came to me just now, but I think a lot about how, there are biases that are introduced when we're dealing with AI and technology, right? So there's reverse automation bias where we think that if it's done by a machine, then it can't be right. Right. And this is an example that I always give with self-driving cars, right? If we see that there's one fatality out of, an enormous number of, cars that are on the road, we think, well, let's take them all off the road. That's certainly not going to work. Meanwhile, we, of course, human fatalities by human driven vehicles are in unfortunate numbers, as we know. But the reverse is also true, right? Where we just have too much deference to machines, right? And we get AI slop and, we're seeing that sort of thing all over the place. And so I think we have to be really thoughtful about the inclusivity mindset when it comes to technology and tech capabilities, right? And being inclusive of the capabilities and the diversity of what they can offer, right? Almost diversity of thinking and diversity of thought, and diversity of capability when it comes to machine capabilities, essentially. And now when we are seeing digital agents enter the workforce and they are expansive of the human workforce, I think that, our ideas around what DE&I means and inclusivity, right? And I think also has to evolve. And that goes for both digital agents, right, and technology, and also technologists who are working with those AI systems, right, and agents. I saw something yesterday. I think the managing partner of McKinsey said that they are now organizationally a workforce of 60,000, but 20,000 of those are agents, digital agents. And I thought that was really, really cool.
So we've sort of talked about mindset a little bit, but on the skills that you feel the law firm of the future needs, what skills are you looking for from the lawyers themselves? How much are you looking for different types of people coming into the law firm that you're, sort of building as part of, a transformation strategy to get to where you think law firms are going?
Yeah, this is so interesting, right? So when you start to talk about hybrid teams and digital agents and human and analog teams, digital and analog teams, and the skills matrices required for the growth path and the success of digital agents, right, and human agents and human workers and what that looks like in supervisory structures, I think one of the key skills that has not really been a priority for law firms to date is systems thinking. So thinking in terms of systems and architectures and there's a lot of dialogue around, work at the middle layers of associate ranks will go away, right? Or at the junior levels will go away. I actually don't think that's true at all. I think the nature of the work will change. For the law firms who get it right, I think the nature of the work will change because there will be a lot of sophisticated content review that will need to get done, right? Analyses that will need to get done. Systems architectures that will need to be put in place, agents that will need to be overseen, just like junior associates are overseen, right? Agents that will need to be trained. There are already different types of agents, right? There are symbolic agents that are coming to the fore, which is essentially just a fancy way of saying it's an agent who is really good at doing a narrow set of tasks. So you can think about it as like, as an M&A expert or your IP expert on an M&A transaction, right? They are advising on one specific part of the deal, and that's their domain, and that's it. So you now have agents that are starting to operate in that way. But how do you create the optimal agent architecture and infrastructure for your deal team, for your law firm, right? For your broader practice, both locally and, globally. So these are things that we have not had to think about organizationally. And I think this is not specific to legal. This is something that across organizations, managers will need to think about. But this is really interesting to me. And I think that kind of skill set of understanding the scope of work, what are the skills needed to do, a certain task, to run a deal, to respond to a litigation matter, how does it all fit together, and how do you plug in different skill sets, and what is the human doing, and how are they reviewing, the hybrid workforce that's on their team? That's interesting and incredibly relevant.
And should that be for the lawyer? Is that skill set you'd be looking in the lawyers or new people coming into the firm?
I think it's a mix of both. It's an evolution of it's how you evolve an organization. And, I think there's upskilling that's needed. There's a lot of domain expertise that's needed. And it's critically important, right, that we leverage existing expertise and just look to how an organization can evolve. And it all starts with what is it that will benefit the client? I always start there, right? And then you work backwards and you start to fill in the blanks and you start to map towards that. It's never abstract in my mind.
And do you have a sense as to how this works in practice and whether it really works? So I've felt that sometimes lawyers can have like huge prejudice against non-lawyers. They think like, oh, we're the kind of fee earners, we're the experts. We've got this like fancy degree stamp, and historically, certainly in the UK, people used to have to own part of the law firm to be a lawyer, and it's so against the kind of culture to accept people almost with different skill sets, or to find ways of working together, or
Yeah.
and that yes, sometimes we kind of know we need all these skills, and AI is maybe almost just another iteration of that. Maybe we need project managers before, and actually we would be better on our timescales with the clients, but maybe we never let them in because it was actually a cultural blocker.
Yeah.
So I'm curious as to how you think it can actually work in practice. I'm agreed on that theory.
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. And before I answer, I'd love to turn this one back to both of you. I mean, you guys are seeing so many legal teams, right? You're working with so many legal teams. And I love to, I don't love the word vendor, as you know, I like to call you guys partners. But as you are partnering with law firms and you're seeing different teams operate, what are you seeing that's most successful? And you can certainly answer the question of what are you seeing that doesn't work, right?
It's the cultural piece, it's the kind of culture eat strategy for breakfast piece, and that's where it crashes. And actually, what I've seen work best is where the culture is already in a firm that's accepting of different skill sets, that's curious, that's open minded, doesn't assume that people who've been there longer are always right. And the firms actually I think it's almost the other way around. It's the firms with more adaptable cultures that are actually seeing the results, and possibly more up for hiring innovation roles and leaders, and letting different kinds of thinking into the way they work. So it might be a little bit self-fulfilling in that the firms that have already got the good culture have the culture to then adopt it. But Dan, what are you seeing?
Like any type of change, any technology that's being brought in, there's a huge behavior change piece that's part of making that happen. I think not the only thing, but the major thing that's different here is just the pace at which everything's happening, and the pace at which there's like the driver and the need for immediate change. But I think the fundamentals are still the same, and we've been running it at Legatix for the last, 10 years. And in equal parts, it's amazing to see how far we've developed. But it's also, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I probably thought things would be a little further along, because it just takes a lot of time. And we've got a bit of a playbook as to the things that we see that do work really well. And I think I'd be really interested in your perspective on this, Ilona, but I think a lot of those same fundamentals are the things that are key for the change from an AI perspective. And they're things like role modeling, like, what, from a culture perspective, Anthony, to your point, like, what is the mindset of the partners, senior partners, C-suite managing partner of the firm? Are they bought into this? Are they actually showing that same behavior that we're looking to, to get from our lawyers? Are they saying, this is something that's really important, I want you to do it because we see it in the data? If we've got a partner in the initial demo as part of a rollout, that they don't even need to ever log into the platform. But if they're actually saying, this is something I value, this is something I want you to use, lawyers will go back to their office and they will use it. If they're not there, then they think maybe this isn't something that's that valued and they don't do it. It's about things like success stories. How do you actually get some early successes and showcase them, and doing some of the things that don't scale to start with? It's going to take time, but invest in that early on, and then it gains momentum and it progresses. There are a number of these things that are part of a framework, and I think the same things generally still apply, the AI tools that are coming out and the general transformations that firms are looking to achieve. But yeah, I'd love your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think this is a really important one. And this goes back to the inclusivity point, right? I think and I've said this internally, right? I really believe this. I think tech talent needs to be celebrated. And that's not how traditional law firms operate. And when I say tech talent, I mean, forward deployed legal engineers internally, right? Those building products, solutions architects, those who are, working on data transformation efforts, IT colleagues who are, incredibly critical to the infrastructure of the organization and making sure that the organization can set up for success when it comes to AI systems. In AI and innovation teams, right, who are building data science capabilities and are generally, made up of a mix of technologists in some shape or format. And I think we will start to see much more hybrid delivery. So legal teams, right, matter teams, litigation teams, they will start to embed elements of tech capabilities in them. And that means that the skills matrices across the organization will have to evolve in terms of how we evaluate talent, how we celebrate talent, how we develop growth paths for talent. And the playbooks for this, I do think, have already been written because we've seen other professional services sectors, right? Banking, consulting, they've already done this. They've essentially introduced, technology into their back-end infrastructure about a decade ago, if not more. And they have had to, develop skills matrices for their AI engineers, their data scientists, and related skills that pop up within the organization. So I think the answers are there for us. I think they are in other industries. And that's why this kind of cross-industry perspective is something that I keep progressing, because I think the more we can learn from the world around us, the better off we'll be, because legal advice is not just legal advice. In the best case scenario, it's advisory and strategy, right? It is informing your strategic perspective for your organization. And it is, both reactive and proactive. And to do that, you really have to, deliver differently. But I think the short answer is, let's celebrate new types of talent and let's think about how to embed them more closely.
So you've had that experience, Ilona, having been at McKinsey and MasterCard and sort of seen that other perspective.
Yeah.
What things do you feel, so you've noted a few things that you feel you can learn from other industries. Are there things that you do feel are unique to legal that just don't transfer across as well?
I think that, in short, no. I think we can learn a lot. There's a lot of room for us to embed what we haven't yet embedded. And that's the exciting piece, right? There's a lot of runway, there's a lot of opportunity. And learning from what other industries have done well, learning from their runway in the last decade is incredibly informative, because a decade is a long time. And generally, where they've landed now is probably, calibrated to where they should have landed. But I'm sure it took trial and error. And so understanding the success stories, understanding the human element of how they got there, right? We were talking about that a little bit in the pre-recorded discussion, but that's a really important piece of it, is it won't all work all the time. But I think it has to be iterative. It has to be agile, and taking different lessons from different industries is critically important, right? And just even the idea of working in agile. We don't do that in legal, but that's how things are done, right? I'm sure that's how you guys work. That's how things are done in tech, consulting, right? Banking to some extent. So why don't we work in agile? Why don't we work in sprints and iterative cycles? And how do we, introduce that kind of fail fast and succeed fast mentality?
I founded Legatics 10 years ago, and I was an unusual lawyer because I had a science background and then I became a lawyer. And I was starting to think about the work in a different way. I was starting to see it in terms of process, project management, digitization, collaboration. I was like, hang on, the work could actually be done in a different way. And we'd finish a deal and the partner would get really excited, be like, oh, this is like the first deal we've had with a kind of Islamic finance clause for this kind of wind farm or something. And I'm like, yeah, that was kind of cool, but it was like this little bit, this one clause in like the whole process. All of the rest of the thing was this enormous process, which was very, very similar to the last deal you did. But they don't think of the deal that way. They think of it as like, I don't know, the one special thing, or that there's a kind of exceptionalism or interest in certain parts of the deal, which just isn't in the kind of process and in the structure. And it can be a really difficult environment to start in when you don't have that like structured process, systematized thinking in the first place. And this is something we're trying to push with the platform is like, if you have everything in a system, you've got a great like starting point to go and do more from. But it's just not how lawyers think quite a lot. I think, like human relationships, which is a huge skill set that's important. But I don't know. I think that's some of why it can be so difficult in legal. Not that the needs are any different.
I was just going to, my question was broadly like on Anthony's topic. I think with what you were saying about the kind of culture of failing fast, I still struggle with that in a law firm environment, because I think about some of the changes we're looking to implement internally with using AI ourselves. Like we've had some massive failures internally with some of the systems we're trying to bring in, particularly from an agentic perspective. And I just imagine myself sitting in a law firm trying to do that, and the risk that's involved with doing it and the mindset. I don't know. I still struggle. How do you think about that? Because I do think it's a different mindset, for example, in a technology company or some
Yeah.
other industries versus,
So I'll let Elena answer in a second, but I think it's also like, it's like, where's the cost pressure coming from as well, right?
Exactly.
Because if you don't face that cost pressure and you're fine doing it in the way that gives you the highest, the lowest risk outcome. So you are hunting for every single risk. You don't care if you put 100 people on it and they spend all night and burn tons and tons of hours on it. It's about getting it exactly right. And that is where your pressure lies, is the fear of getting something wrong, compared to like cost drivers where you're like, okay, well, we're not going to be thinking all the time about how we get perfection here. We're thinking about like, how do we reduce like the resource levels, or even new types of client work where they're like, I don't know, we just want this work done in a completely new way that wasn't even possible before. So I think it goes a little bit to where those drivers are as well. Elena, what do you think?
I think the drivers are really important. I think it's also an architecture question, right? I think, why not set up a sandbox? Set up a sandbox where something is low risk, right? Where you can pilot things internally. The impact is, it's protected. It's shielded, right? And you basically have room for experimentation. You have sort of an incubation of interesting ideas, right? And you have a space for it. That is the new and emerging field of opportunity, I think. And that's where innovation and AI within law firms can really have a moment. Traditionally, we haven't had the need for that in law firms, right? It was much more direct. It was, you have a need to do a matter, you have a need, to do a case, and you engage with the matter is closed, right? You move on to the next. But now it's about, what can be built? How can we deliver differently? How can we think about strategic differentiation? Those are much more strategic exercises that are a true business need, right? And those are coming from, they are not directly coming from the client in the sense that the client is asking for them necessarily, but I think translating what clients may want or predicting what clients may want leads you to that place. And so then the question is, how do you set it up so that it can be effective internally?
but see, that's interesting for me because the sandbox makes sense to
Yeah.
provide them a safe environment to do it. But quite
Yeah.
often then that won't be billable client work.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. R&D is,
So
yeah.
then you've got to rethink the
Yeah,
overall incentive
billing,
structure.
qualified non-billables. Yes, this is the bigger conversation, right? And so transformation does not happen in a vacuum, and it doesn't happen without shifting delivery models, shifting fee structures, right? Shifting perspectives on how you deliver to map to those fee structures, and more sophisticated delivery. And I think it has to take R&D. And I've said this in other forums, but I really believe this to be true. If you think about the Netflix example, right? I remember back in the day, just out of college, when I signed up for Netflix and my roommates had Netflix, and we would get DVDs in the mail. And we would, subscribe to the DVDs, and that's how Netflix worked. It was a DVD, platform essentially, and you got the movies that you wanted and you picked them a week in advance, and then the DVDs came in the mail, and that was that. But certainly it had to be true that while Netflix was mailing out those DVDs, they were investing R&D into building their algorithm in the back end, right? Digital media powerhouse. But that was R&D at the time. So how do you measure ROI from that R&D that was in a sandbox, right? You can't. But that ROI would have been measurable years down the line where Blockbuster, became Blockbuster in the history books and Netflix became Netflix, right? And I think I could be wrong about this, so you can fact check me, but I think they still have a distribution of a small amount of DVDs for people who want to subscribe. I could be wrong about that, but I think I read that somewhere. And that's just fascinating, right? Because that was their entire delivery model, but then they reimagined it and they still held on to, what it was for whatever reason, but maybe as a relic or maybe just because why not?
It's interesting when firms, and even when we invest in AI internally, like the biggest thing I think we're investing in is the mindset and the people and the culture and the way they think about their work. Like the technology will 100% change. The AI, the particular models you'll use will have probably already changed. But I always feel the biggest investment, certainly in like law firms, and I have found for us as well, is in that mindset. Um, yeah, it's like adaptability, it's positivity around AI, it's experimentation, it's even just skill sets in how to contain risk and have a sandbox where you experiment with something and then you work out how to take it into the real world or something like that. That always feels like the biggest investment.
As you're looking to like even just the year ahead, Ilona, and you're thinking of, the team that you develop out or, structures that you're putting ahead for current lawyers that you're hiring, like how do you map that out when things are changing so quickly in terms of actually, just is there the core kind of skills and capabilities that you're looking at for the here and now? And then are you already kind of mapping, I don't know, job descriptions for the year
Exactly.
ahead? And then maybe kind of given this is where we're going with agentic, type things that we might be looking for these job descriptions in the future?
In short, yes. And I won't give away too much secret sauce, right? But I think learning from other industries and what other industries like tech, call certain roles or how they identify certain roles is really helpful and predictive. I also think this is one of my favorite quotes by Alan Kay. The best way to predict the future is to create it. Right. And so if I want to understand where things are going, the best thing that I can do is to analyze it thoughtfully and then build to that. Right. And make that the actual future state, right? Really thoughtfully and investing carefully in that. But I think it's really, a lot of kind of the underpinnings of what we're talking about here, kind of the common theses are looking across industries and seeing what has made other industries successful in terms of their structures, in terms of their talent focus, right? What they're calling their people, what they're calling certain roles. I see that as highly, highly instructive.
Yeah, I often think in legal tech, we rarely build something new. You can usually look at the industries that have done it first, and that's a massive advantage. I definitely think with like AI, the developer community, partly because they're building things for themselves, but if you look at where agents are in the developer community, it's absolutely huge. And then if you even just take the same technology and backfill it to business processes or something, yeah. But I think that applies to the roles as well. I think that's a really interesting approach.
Are you seeing that across firms? Are you seeing firms hiring more technologists and hiring, legal engineers, or are you seeing it as sort of just a start of a trend, but not yet fully actualized?
We see a lot of it. I think the UK has always been ahead on this actually, because there's a greater willingness to spend on central business functions. So there's more of an incentive for like long-term investment. And I think maybe some of the UK-based firms have actually been thinking in that way for even longer. So there's certainly a huge expansion of that. There's probably still a sense of proportion that has to come with it because we are looking at this from a kind of legal tech lens. And if you look at the amount of the law firm that kind of hasn't changed, and that's still very big. So I think we're in an exciting place. I think AI has driven that up the agenda in a way that we've just never seen before, and now it's really kicking off change that goes beyond AI as well. Um, but there's a big question we face as well sometimes, which is like, oh, do these people even exist that we're creating these roles for?
And there has to be a strong training component too, right? And I really don't like the word training. I think there's a lot to be said about someone learning how to do XYZ within an organization and growing into those roles. And that's why I think adaptability and agility are so important. I remember, over the years, as my friends were working in San Francisco or Silicon Valley, right, and I was working in New York, I heard constantly how different it was, right? The life cycle of a job in San Francisco or Silicon Valley, right, versus New York. Some of my friends would work for a startup for 6 weeks and then just move on, right? And then they would work for the next for 8 weeks, right, and move on. And there was this really quick kind of adaptive learning cycle where you would dive in and you would, dive into the next. You would see if it works. You would see if that works. Right. And that's just not how it was in New York. It was much more kind of, you take on a job, you settle into the role. But I think maybe there's a middle ground. And we talk so much about the apprenticeship model in legal and what that means, right? And how that's trained associates. I don't think the apprenticeship model, with some examples through the industry and some, truly fantastic mentors and lawyers who have really taken on training the younger classes. I think generally it's just osmosis. You're not really an apprentice, but you're just sort of doing the work as you're going through the motions, and things are so busy and you're, working to stay afloat. But now I think there's a real opportunity to really learn, right? To really apprentice if we structure the opportunity thoughtfully. And I think AI can be such a meaningful agent of change in that sense, or, assistive in being an agent of change if we set it up the right way.
My dad is still a lawyer, but he talks about what it was like for him in the early part of his career. And to your point about the apprenticeship kind of approach, a lot of how he described things was you are the trusted advisor. And there are things that are like deeply, I think ultimately we want to deal with humans around certain things. I want to be able to sit down and have a conversation and talk through something thorny. A lot of, legal issues, the negotiations can be, difficult to navigate. And I don't think that they're all just going to be done computer to computer. And like, we know what everyone's negotiating positions are. And it's, okay, each person pushes a button and you get to fully agreed terms. There's something deeply human and personal in that. But what role does the technology play, and what role do the people play in that? And I don't know, what excites me about it is there's this opportunity, I think, for us to go back to being that trusted advisor more potentially, and thinking of those other deeply human things, that we can do. But we've got to just navigate what are those things that are deeply human and what are the things that technology does best.
I couldn't agree more. I say this all the time. I think I mean, I am a techno optimist. I always believe that, technology is helping us, get to a better place while, of course, understanding that there are risks. But I think in the best case scenario, and from a realist perspective, tech can help us be more human if we use it the right way, right? It can take away a lot of the rote stuff that's really tough, that's really exhausting, right? That may lead to burnout. And it can help us just really think, right? Think differently and think much more creatively. I've built presentations using voice activation, right? I've iterated, I've strategized with AI, and it is just so much more fun. And it's not that it takes me less time, right? It can be that same amount of 5 hours or 6 hours or whatever it would be, but it is so fun. And I really enjoy it.
There's nothing more I love actually at the moment than just like walking around with a headset, just chatting to AI, like almost just shutting my eye. It's getting into like a deep, kind of like thoughtful space, just almost focusing on pure thought. Because for me, the second I actually have to like type, I'm starting to work with like words in order and linguistic constructs that can be quite difficult. But if I can just almost lie on my back with my eyes shut and think, and then have something even structure my thoughts and give it back to me and challenge me again, and then go around in cycles like that. It's absolutely fantastic, and I must say it's led to me really enjoying work in all sorts of different ways that I never had before, which I must say contrasts to the work of a junior lawyer.
It's so different, right? And that sort of like intellectual nirvana, when you can apply your subject matter expertise to it, right? When you can remove the need for hands-on keyboards and really just yield productivity through voice activation and reasoning and strategy, and then have that be turned into work product and then iterate on that work product. That is such a beautiful thing, right? That's so cool. I always think about the movie Her, with Scarlett Johansson all those years ago. That is essentially what that movie was, right? It was an AI system that was always in Joaquin Phoenix's ear, and he was walking around with it. And I think about this all the time, how artists always get there first, right? They get there decades ahead of time because they have this imaginative range where they can get there and they can think about all the things that can be, and then the tech actually catches up and it finally gets there. And so I think, if going back to the start of the conversation, if we're predicting where things are going, I think we should look to the artists, look to the movies, look to the books that are kind of predicting and writing out these trajectories, because we'll probably be there in about 15 years, if not 5 years.
Just maybe to wrap things up a bit, Ilona, but I'm given your role working a lot with senior management within a law firm, what skills and behaviors do you feel that those partners, senior management within a law firm should be role modeling if they're really serious about this transition?
So McKinsey has this concept of servant leadership, right? Where you essentially are leading by serving. You are serving your team, you're serving your client. And I think that's really powerful. And I've always tried to carry that forward in my team, in my leadership style. And I think the more that we can do that in a law firm, right, to understand that we are leading by serving both our people and our clients, that can be really powerful. I think being part macro strategist, right? Again, that cross industry point, looking to see what success has looked like across analog industries, or even, different industries, and what we can learn from that. And I think open-mindedness is probably the most important piece of it, right? A really kind of critically thinking, anchored open-mindedness, where you're constantly thinking about what's around the corner. I always think about Peloton, right? And what happened with Peloton during COVID. So, Peloton was doing so well. We were all at home. We were all, on our bikes at home. And there were bikes that were, being sold, en masse, essentially. But it had to be true that at some point the pandemic would subside and that we would all go back to normal life, right? And I think Peloton had that moment towards the tail end of COVID, where, they weren't selling as many bikes. So I think I always think about that in terms of my own strategic planning and thinking, in terms of where is that moment where everything is going really, really well for, strategy mapping organizationally. But what is an event that could shift, right? How do we map to the future state that could be different? How do we prepare for it? How do we design for, success across different potential outcomes, right? And different future states? And what is a future state that we should be mindful of? That's always very much top of mind for me. And I think, so open-mindedness and looking around the corner, hugely important.
That may have been the answer to the final question I was going to ask you, which is, if you had one message for managing partners or practice leaders listening to this episode, what would you want them to take away?
Yeah, I think it would have to be that. I think that's exactly it. It would have to be that. And I think managing partners are starting to do that already. We're starting to see shifts in strategic applications, right, across firms. And I think different types of CXOs being brought into organizations is a great example of that, right? Giving runway to new types of opportunity, offering space strategically and from an investment perspective organizationally, right? And giving trust to new types of skill sets within firms. I think all of those will have to be necessary, right? And not at all sufficient, but necessary in terms of what will set up for success across, the law firm space, where transformation will need to be first and, front and center over the next few years.
Ilona, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you both so much. This has been great.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.